My heart froze the moment I reached out to her, with the slow music enveloping the room, and heard, without hesitation, that she'd rather dance with her own boss. It wasn't just her refusal, it was the tone, the ease with which she said it, as if there were nothing wrong with changing right there, in front of everyone. My hand fell to my side as if it weighed tons, and in the silence that fell within me, I understood everything. It wasn't just glances at work anymore, it wasn't just innocent conversation at lunch, there was something deeper, something that had long ago removed me from the place I should have in her life. It was in that second that the words left my mouth with a frightening calm, "Then choose him as a partner, because I'm leaving your life right now." I didn't shout, I didn't argue, I just turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind her scent, the music, and an entire life I thought still had some meaning. As I drove that night, the city passed by the windows in a blur, and every image, every light, seemed to remind me of what I was missing, but along with it came a bitter relief, as if I had finally pulled out a thorn I'd been carrying without realizing it. I arrived home and, without a second thought, began removing every piece of myself from that place. Clothes, books, paintings, even the little souvenirs I'd once bought for her on trips. Everything was packed into the car in a piercing silence. I didn't cry, I didn't allow myself to. I knew that if I let a tear escape, my resolve might waver, and I didn't want to go back. I knew there was no going back from what I'd seen and felt that night. Hours later, when she walked into the house, she found emptiness. The sofa seemed larger, the shelves were bare, the bed no longer had my unmade side. And it was in this emptiness that she must have felt the weight of what she'd done, but I wasn't there to see it. I believed, for a moment, that she would run into his arms, that she would find the comfort she'd denied me, and maybe that was what she wanted. But what I didn't know was that, on the other hand, he had no plans for her. To him, it was all just a distraction, something convenient to fill his free time and his ego. Reality hit her like a sharp blow. There was no reserved place by his side, no promise, no future. She was just a pastime. As she sank into this silence, I moved on. Not with joy, not immediately, but with an almost mechanical determination to rebuild who I was. At first, my days were heavy, each memory of her coming back to me forcefully, as if my mind insisted on torturing me. The mornings tasted bitterly of absence, and the nights were longer than they should have been. But little by little, something inside me began to loosen. I began to look around and notice that there was life beyond that story, that there were people who looked me in the eye with open eyes, without secrets behind them. Months passed, and as I learned to breathe without her weight, something began to shift within me. Anger gave way to a strange peace, and even though there were still scars, they no longer bled. I knew one day she would try to find me. It was inevitable. When someone loses something they took for granted, sooner or later, the urge to try to get it back comes. And that's exactly what happened. One day, without warning, she reappeared. Not with arrogance, but with a look I'd never seen in her, that of someone who knew they'd destroyed what couldn't be rebuilt. The reunion wasn't what I'd so often imagined. There were no desperate pleas, no theatrical tears. She simply looked at me, and in that look was more pain than any words could convey. She tried to smile, but the smile shattered before it even began. She spoke of regret, of sleepless nights, of how what she thought was freedom had become an unbearable emptiness. I listened calmly, without interrupting. Perhaps because, deep down, I knew there was nothing she could say that would change what had been done. And when she finished, she looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I simply said I forgave her. Yes, I forgave her, but not to return. Forgiveness wasn't an invitation to start over, it was simply the way I found to close a chapter that no longer had any pages to write. From then on, we became just friends. It wasn't a verbal agreement, it was something established through silence, through the absence of any gesture that might suggest otherwise. She still tries to get closer in subtle ways, recalling old stories, asking questions about my life, but there's no longer room for her the way there was before. And she knows it. Perhaps this is the cruelest part for her, having me around, but unable to reach me. Fate, however, had an irony in store. One day, we were at a casual gathering with mutual friends, and she was standing beside me when another woman arrived. A light presence, a genuine smile, a look that made me forget she, the one who betrayed me, was there. I introduced her as someone special, and I saw, the very moment our eyes met, that it completely clicked for her. She realized I had moved on, that the place that had once been hers was now occupied by someone who didn't carry the weight of betrayal, someone who looked at me the way she no longer knew how to look. Her silence in that moment said more than any speech. And perhaps, deep down, the true punishment wasn't her lover's rejection, nor the emptiness of her lonely nights, but the fact that, even forgiven, she would never again be my choice. Realizing that the love she thought was eternal was indeed alive, but in another heart, on another face, and that now it was I who no longer wanted her. But what she doesn't know, is that, before that moment, there was something that changed everything, something that made the line between what we felt break forever, and that sealed our fate forever. Something she never imagined could have happened, and that meant that, even after forgiving, I could never see her the same way again. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not condone and never romanticize any kind of betrayal. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry a harsh truth: betrayal destroys lives, corrodes feelings, and leaves scars that never fade. Get ready, because now you're about to hear an intense, emotional, and shocking story. The day began like so many others for Daniel, with the soft sound of his alarm clock mingling with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen. He always woke a few minutes early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, taking advantage of those moments to gaze at his room illuminated by the first light of dawn. Beside him, Elena still slept, breathing peacefully, her hair spread across the pillow. For him, these were the most quietly precious moments of the day, that brief interval when the world hadn't yet begun to take its toll and when he could simply appreciate the peace. When she moved, looking for a more comfortable place, he smiled to himself, remembering how they had met and how, ever since that first meeting, she seemed to have a particular way of filling the spaces around her, as if everything became more alive with her presence. Their relationship had been built on a blend of patience and intensity. They met at a mutual friend's event, and from that night onward, their conversations became more frequent, their dates longer, until their lives began to fit into each other's almost naturally. Daniel, with his calm and attentive manner, balanced Elena's more decisive and spontaneous temperament. He admired her ability to speak her mind bluntly, while she found in him a safe haven, someone who knew how to listen and, at the same time, offer thoughtful advice. This complementarity was reflected in the routine they created together: short weekend trips, impromptu dinners at home, long conversations on the couch about whatever topic arose. It was a bond that felt solid, built on mutual respect and admiration. The home they shared was a reflection of both of them. Every corner had a detail that told a part of their story. In the living room, a painting purchased at an art fair during a trip to the seaside, where they ended up getting lost in the streets and discovered a small gallery by chance. In the kitchen, spices and utensils that Elena made a point of bringing from different places, as if each object carried a little piece of memory. The bedroom, always organized by Daniel, had the blue bedspread she insisted on choosing, which he initially found overdone but grew to love over time. The life they built there was made up of these little things, these shared choices that, over the years, transformed into a kind of invisible map of their relationship. Daniel's friends always commented on their rapport. When they met, it was clear how they looked at each other, how a simple gesture or a light touch seemed enough to communicate what didn't need to be said out loud. Elena, in turn, spoke proudly of how Daniel always found a way to support her, whether at work or with her personal projects. He wasn't just her companion, he was also her encourager, her patient listener, her counselor when she felt lost. This connection was, for all who observed, proof that they were on the right path, and perhaps that's why no one ever imagined that one day there would be a shock. Mornings were almost always a rehearsed choreography. Daniel would make coffee, Elena would take care of the rest of the breakfast, and together they would share a few minutes before each headed off to their appointments. On the way to work, he would often send her a short message, not out of obligation, but because he liked to remind her he was thinking of her. She would respond with an emoji or a light-hearted phrase, and this simple exchange became a cherished habit. During the day, when they had time, they would chat briefly, exchange news, or share something funny. It was a relationship that, in his view, was kept alive not by grand gestures, but by the consistency of these small demonstrations. Daniel wasn't a man of excess. He worked diligently, but always prioritized time with Elena and his friends. He liked to think about the future and make plans, but he also knew how to enjoy the present. Elena, on the other hand, had a faster pace, always involved in various activities, seeking new challenges and experiences. He admired this energy and often let himself be carried away by it, leaving his comfort zone to accompany her in something different. Still, there were times when he felt her world was slightly more hectic than his, but he never considered it a problem. On the contrary, he believed it was precisely this difference that kept their relationship interesting. On weekends, they often hosted friends for dinner or went out to new places. Daniel loved cooking for the people he liked, and Elena excelled at entertaining, always finding a way to make everyone feel comfortable. These evenings often ended with low music, lingering conversations, and sometimes the two of them sitting together, exchanging knowing glances while everyone around them laughed. On these occasions, he felt a quiet pride in having her by his side, knowing that she, too, chose him every day. There was, however, something subtle that Daniel didn't clearly perceive. An almost imperceptible change in certain gestures, slightly longer pauses in some responses, glances that sometimes shifted too quickly. It wasn't something that immediately aroused suspicion, but to a careful observer, it could have been a sign that something in their dynamic was beginning to shift. Still, he preferred to believe in the harmony they had built, keeping his focus on the good things and the idea that their love was strong enough to withstand any adversity. Evenings, when they weren't with friends, were spent watching movies, watching TV shows, or simply talking. Daniel enjoyed listening to Elena talk about her projects and ideas, and she seemed to feel free to share everything with him. This space of trust was something he deeply valued. In his mind, their relationship was a complete partnership, a rare balance. And it was precisely this certainty that kept him calm, never imagining that, at some point in their timeline, something might shatter what seemed to be unshakable foundations. Their life continued with an almost predictable naturalness, which for Daniel was synonymous with stability. They had plans for the coming year, trips in mind, even a small home renovation project. Seemingly, everything was going as it should. He didn't know, at that moment, that behind this perfect facade, silent forces were beginning to move, and that, without realizing it, he was just steps away from a moment that would forever change the way he saw the woman beside him and, most importantly, the way he saw himself in front of her. What was to come had no definite shape yet, but it was already casting subtle shadows over what, until then, had seemed untouchable. As the weeks passed, Daniel began to notice small changes in the rhythm that had characterized their lives until then. They weren't abrupt shifts, but small details that, together, formed a new pattern almost imperceptible at first glance. Elena would arrive a little later some days, with quick excuses and explanations that sounded plausible, but without the same warmth that used to accompany her stories. Quiet dinners gave way to quick meals, often with her cell phone vibrating discreetly beside her, and the familiar glances of before became rarer, replaced by distracted expressions that she disguised with brief smiles. Daniel, who had always valued trust, didn't allow himself to harbor suspicions right away, preferring to believe that it was simply a more hectic period for her, perhaps an accumulation of responsibilities that left her tired at the end of the day. There were, however, times when the silence between them didn't feel the same. Before, when there was nothing to say, the silence felt comfortable, a shared space that brought them even closer together. Now, it felt like a disguised distance, as if she were physically there but her mind wandered elsewhere. Some weekends, Elena would say she had commitments that didn't include Daniel, meetings with friends, short courses, or simply needed some time to herself. He accepted, trying not to show the uneasiness that was beginning to grow in the back of his mind. Still, there was something in his gut that told him the atmosphere around them was changing. It was on a special night that Daniel began to sense something concrete was behind this new dynamic. A couple of friends had thrown an elegant party, the kind that required well-chosen attire and extra attention to every detail. Daniel saw it as an opportunity to be together like before, to laugh, dance, and remember how much they loved to have fun together. Elena seemed excited, but during the event, something in him began to weigh on him. As they entered the room, she quickly stepped aside to greet acquaintances, while he stayed chatting with a few close friends. Daniel's eyes followed her through the crowd, and every time he saw her, she was engaged in animated conversation, but not meeting his gaze as she had before. Until, when the music changed to a slow song, he felt the urge to revive a tradition they had, dancing together whenever the opportunity arose. He approached with a smile, extending his hand to her, hoping she would accept as she had so many times before. But her answer was different, dry, almost rehearsed. She preferred to dance with someone else that night. Not just anyone, but someone who, until that moment, Daniel had seen only as a distant part of her life, an unimportant acquaintance. The weight of the words came not only from their content, but from the naturalness with which they were spoken, as if there were no problem in refusing. At that moment, something in Daniel's chest tightened tightly. The surroundings seemed to lose their sound, and the lights, their brightness. He felt his blood heat and freeze at the same time, but he didn't let it show. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a serenity that hid his inner turmoil, and simply said that if she preferred to be with someone else at that moment, then let it go on like that, because he was leaving. The walk to the exit was made with firm steps, without looking back. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, but it didn't bring the hoped-for relief. Driving back was like walking down a long, narrow hallway, where each recent memory flashed by like a painful flash. Arriving home, the decision was immediate and irrevocable. Daniel didn't want to wait for explanations that might or might not come. He didn't want to spend another night sharing a space that suddenly no longer felt like his. In a few hours, he gathered his belongings, storing each item with the coldness of someone who knew he wouldn't return. There were no notes, no goodbyes, only the absence that would speak for itself. When Elena arrived, the house no longer bore the signs of her presence. Her clothes were gone from the closet, her toothbrush was gone, and even the books that used to be scattered around the living room were gone. The physical emptiness mirrored a larger, deeper void, one that perhaps she would only understand with time. Initially, she sought comfort from those she believed were by her side unconditionally, but there she found only coldness and distance. The reality, raw and painful, began to set in. The life she knew had changed in the blink of an eye, and the security she thought eternal had dissolved in a few hours. In the following days, Daniel kept his distance, busying himself with work and adopting new habits to avoid the temptation to reminisce. There were no plans to meet up, no impulsive messages sent. Just silence, which this time wasn't comfortable, but necessary. Elena, for her part, tried to process what had happened, alternating between moments of disbelief and others of anger, but deep down, a nagging feeling began to grow, something that wouldn't dissipate, the fear that there would be no going back. Distance became the new reality, and although the world around them continued to spin, for them time seemed to have taken on a different cadence. Daniel avoided crossing paths with her, while Elena searched for answers she couldn't find. Memories of simple gestures, long conversations, and moments of complicity surfaced involuntarily, carrying with them an unbearable weight. It was as if every detail of the recent past was now charged with a different meaning, revealing nuances that had previously gone unnoticed. It was only later, when they unexpectedly met again, that their eyes finally met again. There was no longer the same warmth as before, but a silent tension that spoke volumes without needing words. And in that moment, even if neither of them said it out loud, they knew something irreversible had happened, and that what was to come would not only change their relationship but also leave scars that would be impossible to erase. The afternoon was cloudy, and the breeze carried that gentle chill that precedes rain. Daniel walked slowly down the tree-lined street toward the cafe where he'd arranged to meet Elena. It wasn't a pre-planned meeting, but she'd insisted. Her message had been brief, almost urgent, and for some reason, he felt he couldn't simply ignore it. As he entered, the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread filled the air. She was already there, sitting by the window, her hands clasped on the table, her gaze fixed on nothing. When she saw him, she stood hesitantly, as if unsure whether to embrace him or keep her distance. He opted for just a slight nod and sat down, hoping she'd be the one to initiate the conversation. For a few seconds, silence reigned, until she took a deep breath and said she needed to say something she'd been holding back for a long time. Her voice was thick with nerves, and the words seemed heavy even before they were spoken. Daniel remained calm, observing every gesture, every hesitation. Elena spoke of regret, of how she'd realized too late the value of what they'd built, of how none of the experiences she'd lived since had brought her the same sense of belonging she'd felt with him. She confessed that, in the first few days after his departure, she tried to convince herself that time would heal things, but with each week his absence became more painful. The memories wouldn't fade, and the comparison with any other companion was inevitable and cruel for anyone with her. He listened to her, but without interrupting, keeping a measured distance, like someone unwilling to raise false expectations. When she mentioned that she needed to tell him what really happened after the breakup, Daniel felt the air shift. His posture, previously relaxed, stiffened, and his eyes searched her face for signs that this wasn't just another attempt to justify himself. Elena looked away, took another deep breath, and said that the day he left her, she ran to the man for whom she had exchanged so many certainties. She believed she would find a new beginning there, but found only closed doors. Her lover, who had been attentive for months, revealed in that moment that he had never had any intention of sharing his life with her. It had been just fun, nothing serious, nothing that would justify profound changes. His words were direct, cold, and humiliating, and in that moment, according to her, something broke irreversibly inside her. Daniel remained silent, but Elena continued, now with tears in her eyes. She said she tried to move on anyway, trying not to think about what she had lost, but that the emptiness was becoming unbearable. She began to realize the magnitude of her mistake, not only because of the rejection she had suffered, but because of the cruel contrast with what she had experienced with him. And then came the part she was most hesitant to say. Nervously intertwining her fingers, she confessed that she had tried to get closer subtly, creating excuses to cross his path, but she realized something had changed. She was no longer the same person to him, and that became clear the day she saw him with another woman. Daniel didn't look away, but his expression showed someone who already knew where this was going. Elena described the scene as a punch in the gut. He was smiling, genuinely happy, and there was a light in his eyes toward his new companion she hadn't seen in a long time. She said that, in that moment, she understood she had lost something she would never get back. She wasn't there to ask him to come back, but to tell him she loved him and that, even if he no longer felt the same way, she needed to know she was still loved, even if it was unilateral and silent. Daniel took a deep breath before responding. He said he no longer held a grudge, that he no longer carried the anger or hurt that had once consumed him. He had learned to move on and, yes, to forgive her. But forgiveness, he explained, didn't mean returning. Forgiveness was freeing oneself, closing a door that no longer had any reason to remain open. He affirmed that he respected her courage in telling the truth, but that the love he had felt had transformed into something different, something without the weight of passion, but also without the intimacy of before. Now, she was just a part of his story, no longer the center of it. Elena lowered her head, fighting back tears. She asked if they could at least be friends, if it was possible to preserve something of what they had shared, even if in a new form. Daniel hesitated for a few seconds and replied that yes, they could be friends, but that didn't mean there was room for anything more. He had moved on, had found someone who made him feel alive again, and he wasn't going to give that up. She nodded almost imperceptibly, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. The silence that followed was no longer the same awkwardness as the last few times they'd met. It was a silence of acceptance, of someone who knows their life has changed course forever. Daniel stood, placed some bills on the table to pay for the coffee, and said he had to go. Elena watched him walk away down the street, each step seeming to carry with it the last chance to reverse what had happened. And as the first drop of rain fell on the cafe window, she realized that, although they had found a space for forgiveness again, the love that once united them would never return. The line separating past and present had been drawn indelibly, and nothing could erase it. The night after their meeting at the cafe brought an unexpected invitation for both of them, a birthday dinner at a mutual friend's house, the kind where people arrive with dessert in hand and leave with a secret hidden in their pocket. Daniel hesitated when he received the message. He knew Elena would probably be there, but he didn't want to hide from places that had once been part of his routine. He decided to take it slow and, like someone turning a page without tearing the book, brought his new companion. She had a simple way of occupying space, a laugh that made no noise, and a look that didn't delve into the past. They arrived hand in hand, without grandiosity, a natural gesture that said more than many speeches. Inside the house, the yellowish lights made everything more intimate, the table carefully set, the aroma of home-cooked food, the low music chosen to not compete with the conversations. A short time later, Elena arrived. She didn't come surrounded by explanations, she came as someone respecting a territory that no longer belongs to her. He met some acquaintances, exchanged brief greetings, and when he finally spotted Daniel, he paused for a second, as if measuring his own courage before moving on. They approached cautiously, and their first contact was an exchange of glances that didn't break the silence. Daniel's new companion, attentive without being intrusive, extended her hand to Elena, offering a delicate greeting, almost a pact of civility. Elena responded with a restrained smile, and for the first time, her face conveyed something that wasn't exactly pain, but a kind of raw acceptance, a certainty difficult to digest. The words emerged with a care felt in the shoulders, not the lips. "Hi, good to see you, how are you?" "I'm fine, thank you, and you?" "Me too," and the shy conversation found its own place, that territory where everyone understands that more than what's said, it's how it's said that matters. Daniel kept his tone calm and introduced them without labels, just by their first names, as if giving the three of them common, clean ground to walk on. Elena nodded, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and searched for something to say without seeming out of place. "Thank you for coming," her new companion said to her kindly, and the simple phrase carried the weight of a gesture of peace. Dinner flowed with travel stories, recipes, and memories of past encounters that didn't need to be revisited. Daniel participated naturally, sometimes smiling at his girlfriend over small details, like quietly asking if she wanted more wine or adjusting her chair for comfort. Elena observed without intruding, like someone watching a movie knowing the ending isn't for them. At one point, a friend put on a playlist with songs that marked different eras of the group, and when a slow song started, the conversation faded a bit, a few couples stood, and the room narrowed and became a makeshift dance floor. It was in this time warp that Elena approached Daniel, unhurriedly, as if demanding anything, and asked, almost in a whisper, for a minute in the garden. He tried to read her expression and nodded, looking at his girlfriend, who responded with a calm, "Go ahead, I'm fine," gesture. They stepped out into the fresh air, where the noise of the party faded to a murmur and the plants held people's secrets. Elena took a deep breath before opening her mouth, as if measuring the impact before taking a step. "I thought a lot about what you said, that forgiving doesn't mean going back," she began, her voice unwavering because the decision had already been made within her. "I wanted to thank you for not pushing me away in anger. You could have done that, and I still would have thought it fair, but you chose a path that prevented me from becoming even lesser in my own eyes." Daniel listened without interrupting, attentive to every twist of her sentence. She continued, "I also needed to ask you one last thing. It's not a request for return, I promise, it's just a request for humanity between two people who were hurt. I wanted you to know that I'm not the same person I was, and I'm not saying this as an excuse, I'm saying it because I want it to be etched in some corner of your memory that I learned, the hard way, but I did learn." He nodded and replied that he truly listened to her, that he had no interest in rewriting anything, but that he was capable of keeping this version of her without resentment. It was then that Elena asked the question she had been carrying since she entered the house, "Can I talk to her for a minute, to your girlfriend, not to undo anything, but to look into the eyes of someone who does you good and say that I am not a threat, that I will not occupy a space that is not mine. Daniel considered for a moment and saw in the question a gesture that wasn't seeking a platform, but rather reparation. He nodded, and they both returned to the living room. His girlfriend was near the dessert table, helping to cut a cake. Elena approached discreetly and excused herself for a moment. The conversation, short, fit into the space between two people who understand there's no need to compete for anything when each knows where they stand. I made a mistake with him, Elena said without drama, and that mistake taught me that there are loves we don't deserve if we don't know how to care for them. I know you care, I saw it, and I wanted to tell you that I respect that I won't use memories to open doors that have already been closed, that I won't be where I'm not invited. The other woman listened with clear attention, replied that she didn't see her as an enemy, that she trusted Daniel and, therefore, wasn't afraid. Thank you for telling me that, she concluded gently, and there was a silent agreement of boundaries and respect. As everyone began to approach the room to sing happy birthday, one of the friends decided to play around and pulled a few people to dance, turning the hallway into a makeshift dance floor. Someone, with no connection to the three of them, approached Daniel and suggested he dance with Elena to reminisce about their old get-togethers. The phrase sounded innocent, but the memory of the room where everything had shattered came back in a flash. The request floated in the air for a second until Daniel calmly replied no, that at that moment he'd rather dance with the person he was with. He didn't say it as an insult, he said it as someone honoring a choice. Elena lowered her gaze, breathed slowly, and, before any discomfort could set in, she stepped forward with a smile without bitterness, "It's all right," and turned to the table to help serve the dishes, regaining the dignity of someone learning to walk differently. Later, as the party was winding down, Elena asked the couple for a ride, but Daniel, realizing the rain was on the road and it would be a long detour for his friends, offered to drive her. His girlfriend nodded without jealousy, secure in her seat. The car smelled of clean fabric and memories that no longer lingered. The journey began in silence, only the sound of water hitting the glass. At the traffic light, Elena said something she'd been holding in for years: "I discovered that love doesn't die from lack of intensity, it dies from lack of care, and that's what I did with ours. I stopped watering it, I walked away from myself and from you at the same time." Daniel responded with calm honesty, "What happened between us doesn't erase what was good, but what was good doesn't sustain what was broken. I moved on, and truly, I hope you too find a way to move on without punishing yourself forever." She nodded, and for the first time the word forgiveness didn't sound like cheap absolution, it sounded like a period that allowed the next line to be drawn. Arriving at her building, Elena held the doorknob without opening it, as if prolonging the last scene a little. "Thank you for today," she said, "not for listening to me, but for treating me like a human being when I myself had stopped acting like one. I won't look for you without reason, I won't call you to stir up what's quiet, I'll learn to inhabit my life without seeking shortcuts along the way." Daniel smiled slightly, "Good night, take care," and she walked down with firm steps, without looking back, as if knowing that strength lies not in resisting goodbye, but in recognizing where it belongs. The days that followed cemented that new, invisible contract. On another late afternoon, by coincidence, the three met again, this time at a small cultural event downtown, the kind of place where people greet each other politely and arrange themselves around the room in intersecting circles. There, Elena handed Daniel a small, simple box, with no ribbons, just a handwritten card. Inside were 2 old photos, a keychain he'd forgotten in a suitcase, and a short note: "I don't keep what belongs to you." He thanked her with a gesture and put it in his inside coat pocket, unopened, respecting the gesture's discretion. His girlfriend, beside him, lightly squeezed his hand, a touch that doesn't question, that simply accompanies. Later, as they were returning home, Daniel told his girlfriend how that cycle had closed inside him differently than he had imagined. Not through victory, not revenge, but through a kind of silent affirmation of someone who chose to continue and was reciprocated by life itself. She listened and said she wasn't afraid of the shadows of the past, that she saw a whole man there, not a survivor on alert. The conversation brought them closer, not through secrets, but through transparency. It was agreed, without bureaucracy, that Elena would be part of a larger circle of coexistence without interfering with the core they were building, and this didn't sound like a concession, it sounded like maturity. A few days later, Elena sent a short message, asking to deliver one last thing that had been left at the old house, a book Daniel always said he wanted to reread. They arranged to meet at the reception desk of a busy building, a neutral location, and respected the timetable. When she arrived, she brought the book wrapped in brown paper and, without preamble, said she was starting therapy, that she wasn't looking for a recipe to reverse anything, but tools to stop repeating the same pattern of shallow choices. Daniel sincerely hoped it would be a good path. Before leaving, Elena asked for one last favor, one of those that doesn't require an immediate answer. I wish that one day, if life allows, we could meet without this shadow, to talk about anything other than what we lost, but about what we managed to build afterward. I wish for a future where words between us are light. He thought for a moment and replied that lightness isn't created in haste, but that he wouldn't close the door on the possibility of a clean conversation, as long as the present was respected. She thanked him, tucked her hair behind her ear again, and left. The most intimate turning point of this second stage didn't happen with a grand gesture, but over a simple Sunday lunch, when Daniel visited his parents and, between stories, they asked if everything was resolved within him. He realized that it was. He spoke little about the past, more about what he was experiencing now, and the peace this brought to the table was like a blanket on a cloudy day. Later, walking hand in hand with his girlfriend down a street where the wind played with the leaves, he told her that he had felt, in the garden at that party, the exact moment his emotional debt was repaid. She smiled and said that sometimes closure isn't a door slamming shut, sometimes it's just a window we close to keep the cold out. Over time, Elena began to rebuild her routine, now with habits that required discipline rather than distraction. She signed up for a Saturday photography course, rekindled old friendships that didn't require explanations, and exchanged occasional, polite messages with Daniel to let him know about group get-togethers, nothing more. On one of these occasions, she sent a single sentence outlining the new phase without asking for anything in return: "Thank you for being a mirror when I needed to see myself." He read it and responded civilly, without opening doors he didn't want to go through, but without closing windows that didn't need to be slammed shut. That same week, something happened that definitively ended the phase of tight knots. One of their longtime friends organized a small get-together in the park, an afternoon of guitar, fruit, and laughter. Daniel went with his girlfriend, Elena showed up later, and the sun shifted as the hours passed. At one point, someone suggested a silly game where each person would say something they had unlearned and relearned that year. When it was Elena's turn, she said, in a clear voice, that she had unlearned the difference between desire and love and relearned to respect her own words. No one applauded, no one dramatized. The sentence was received as one receives something true, with a welcoming silence. Daniel, in turn, said he had unlearned to confuse forgiveness with return and relearned to recognize when life offers a new path. The words weren't trophies, they were realizations. They looked at each other just long enough to acknowledge each other's truth and then returned to the circle. Late that afternoon, almost night, Elena approached Daniel and his girlfriend to say goodbye. "Thank you for today," she said to them both, with the lightness she'd requested at that meeting at the reception. Her girlfriend smiled back, "Take care of yourself," and Daniel added, "See you around." Elena walked away with a calm step, and they watched the city lights come on, little stars that don't ask permission to exist. The present, finally, had chosen its own size. And somewhere between the distant sound of laughter and the low hum of the city, a final question, kept hidden since the first night when everything began to crumble, found its destination and answer, not in the screams of the past, but in the calm of someone who already knows what they want to protect from now on. The cold night wind blew more intensely when Daniel closed the front door and leaned for a moment against the hallway wall. The conversation with Elena, their recent encounters, and that silent peace he'd been feeling formed a strange mixture of relief and reflection. The new life he was building already had firm roots, but there was a part of him that still involuntarily returned to the past, not to relive feelings, but to understand his choices. And it was in this silence that he began to realize a dilemma that had not presented itself so clearly until then: to what extent forgiving truly meant freeing himself, and to what extent it could keep the door ajar for the person who hurt him to try, however subtly, to invade the present. There was no doubt about his feelings for his current partner, but there was an awareness that, by allowing Elena into certain circles and encounters, he was accepting the constant presence of a past he no longer wanted to live. And, even though this presence came without explicit attempts at recapturing, it still carried an invisible weight. That same week, an invitation came to a charity event that would bring together friends, acquaintances, and people Daniel had known in the past. He and his girlfriend confirmed their attendance without much thought, but upon arriving at the venue, they realized Elena was also there, involved in the organization. The situation didn't cause any immediate discomfort, but the dynamic was different. She moved around easily, greeting everyone, and there were moments when their paths inevitably crossed. On one such occasion, Elena approached Daniel with a glass of wine in hand and a serious look, asking to speak privately. His girlfriend, with the same calmness she always displayed, gestured that everything was fine. In the far corner of the room, Elena confessed that she had received a job offer in another city, something that would mean a fresh start not only professionally but also personally. She wanted to know if, in his opinion, this could be the definitive chance to cut the last ties that still bind her to the past. The direct question made Daniel reflect. He replied that only she could decide if she was ready to move away physically and emotionally, but warned that no place, no matter how far away, would resolve what was still unresolved within her. The conversation left a tension in the air that wasn't one of conflict, but of mutual understanding. Daniel knew that this potential change also represented a turning point for him, because if Elena left, the social circle that still connected them would shift, and the interactions that had been cordial would become rare or non-existent. It was an opportunity to completely close a chapter, but also a reminder that some closures come with a feeling of emptiness, even when necessary. His girlfriend noticed his thoughtful expression and, later, in the car, asked if everything was okay. He told her about the proposal Elena had received and the doubt she harbored. Her answer was simple, but loaded with meaning. Sometimes, the right decision for one person may not be the most comfortable for another, but that doesn't mean it isn't necessary. In the following days, Daniel began to notice how certain memories lost their weight when they weren't constantly reactivated by reunions. The moral dilemma became more evident. While he believed in the importance of forgiveness and the ability to maintain a respectful coexistence, he wondered if he wasn't unintentionally trapping himself and Elena in a cycle where their mutual presence prevented complete closure. He noticed that, in social situations, no matter how discreet, there were still curious glances from others, trying to decipher whether there was tension or longing in the air. This realization began to bother him, not because it fueled doubts about the present, but because it reinforced that, for many people, they were still connected by something that no longer existed. Then came an invitation to a small cultural retreat organized by a group of close friends, a weekend in a secluded house surrounded by nature. Daniel and his girlfriend decided to go, and only later did they learn that Elena would also be among the guests. The initial idea was to maintain the same approach as on other occasions, interacting naturally, but the different environment brought a new layer of complexity. Far from routine, interactions became more intense, with everyone participating in the same activities, the same meals, and conversations around the fire. In one of these group conversations, someone suggested that each person share a personal lesson learned in recent years. When it was Elena's turn, she spoke about the importance of taking responsibility for one's own choices and accepting the consequences without seeking justification. She didn't mention names or specific situations, but the subtext was clear to anyone familiar with the story. Daniel listened silently, as did his girlfriend, without needing to comment. Later, close to midnight, Daniel went for a walk in the courtyard, watching the dim lights reflect on the calm surface of the lake. Elena, by chance, had the same idea, and they ended up meeting outside. The conversation began with trivialities, but soon she brought up the topic of possible change. She said she'd thought a lot since the benefit, and that part of her wanted to stay because she'd learned to live with the new dynamic, but another part knew that if she truly wanted to start over, she needed to go. She asked if she left, he would miss having her around, even if only in the form of a cordial friendship. Daniel thought before answering. He said that perhaps he missed her at first, not her presence per se, but the confirmation that everything was resolved, that their time together was proof of that. However, he added that he wouldn't miss having the past always haunting the present. Elena smiled, a sad smile, and said that perhaps that was the answer she needed to hear. The rest of the weekend went by without incident, but there was a silent awareness between them that this might be their last meeting for a long time. Back in their routine, Daniel realized that Elena's possible departure didn't create anxiety in him, but a strange peace. It was as if life was finally aligning the pieces so that each of them could continue on their own path without any loose ends. At the same time, he felt compelled to consider his own limits. To what extent can continued forgiveness become an obstacle to letting go completely? And to what extent would cutting the last ties be an act of liberation, not indifference? This dilemma plagued him for days and was the subject of deep conversations with his girlfriend, who always demonstrated maturity in dealing with the issue. She said she had no problem with him maintaining some contact, as long as it didn't interfere with what they were building. But she also added that if Elena decided to leave, perhaps it would be a good idea to allow the physical distance to solidify what was already emotionally established. Her words resonated, and Daniel began to understand that sometimes the greatest gesture of care one can give someone is to allow them to move on alone, without the crutch of a presence that, even involuntarily, anchors them to what they've been through. A few days later, Elena sent a short message, saying she had made her decision and accepted the job offer. She didn't elaborate on when she would leave or what it would be like, simply stating that she needed to do this for herself. Daniel responded by wishing her luck and reinforcing his belief that she was taking the right step. There were no long goodbyes exchanged, nor promises to stay in touch. It was understood that if they ever met again, it would be in a completely new context, without the shadow of what they had once been. And while this outcome wasn't yet definitive emotionally, he knew he was approaching a point where the past would finally be left where it belonged, behind them. The days following the announcement that Elena would be leaving brought a kind of tense calm, like the silence that precedes a change of seasons. Daniel maintained his routine with discipline, arriving at work early, running again in the late afternoon, cooking with his girlfriend during the week, but there was a new attention hovering over his gestures, an intimate vigil to avoid slipping into memories that could distort the present. The news spread quietly among mutual friends, each reacting with small comments, some wishing him well, others saying it was the right decision, and this created a bubble of normalcy that, however comforting, still required careful choices. It was in this atmosphere that Elena sent a short message, asking for a quick meeting in a neutral location, a discreet cafe between two quiet streets, and the unadorned way she wrote it suggested she had something practical to resolve, not an emotional relapse. Daniel's girlfriend read the message with him, her gaze frank, and said with firm affection that she saw no problem, adding only a clear request for caution, for him to be objective, and for him not to let himself be dragged back into the past by being too polite. Daniel agreed, thanked him for his confidence, and left with the feeling that, deep down, this was the true test of the forgiveness he claimed to practice. At the cafe, Elena arrived first, without heavy makeup, her hair tied back, and the expression of someone who had been packing boxes all morning. On the table lay a manila envelope and a worn cover book. She began by thanking him directly for coming and, bluntly, explained that she needed two things. The first was for him to sign as a witness to the termination of the lease for the old apartment. He knew the landlord, and this would facilitate processes that would otherwise drag on for weeks. The second was more delicate and hesitant. She wanted to donate some items that reminded her of them both. She didn't want to take them to the new city, didn't want to throw them away, and thought perhaps Daniel's sister, who worked in community outreach, would know worthy uses for them. He listened attentively, recognizing in her request a kind of silent ritual of detachment, and replied that he would help with both, that he would bridge the gap with his sister, and that from then on, each object would find a new story to inhabit. Elena nodded, and for a moment her gaze shifted to the street, as if needing to check if the world still revolved outside that square table. "I don't want this to be read as a plea," she said quietly, "but as a responsibility I now recognize. I won't rely on what we were to resolve what's mine. I just need to close well what I myself opened crookedly." Daniel breathed slowly, choosing the right word so as not to misinterpret his tone. You're doing what needs to be done, and that's perhaps the most adult part of all this, moving on without using me as a crutch or expelling me as an enemy. They sorted out the paperwork right there, divided up tasks, and when they got up to leave, Elena held the book out with a certain affection before handing it over. It was the copy he'd always said he wanted to reread at a train station, watching people pass by, and she'd written, on the last page, a simple line anchored in respect: "Thank you for giving me back to me when I deserved nothing more." Daniel received it with a seriousness that needed no speech, put it in his backpack, and, at the door of the cafe, he concluded with a curt nod, "Good luck in your new city." Their farewell would have ended there if, 2 days later, a detail hadn't disrupted the careful arrangement he'd been putting together inside. Elena called late that night, not him, but his sister, and the two of them needed help transporting boxes from the storage room to the institution that would receive the items. The available car couldn't hold everything, the rain was pouring down, and the institution's schedule was tight. The sister called Daniel, embarrassed to mention his name, and asked if she could come by to borrow the car, explaining the urgency. Daniel looked at his girlfriend, explained in 2 minutes what was happening, and she took a deep breath, assessed, and responded frankly without being touchy, "Go ahead, help, but remember what we agreed." She sat on the couch with a mug of tea and a book on her lap, the picture of confidence that doesn't ask for guarantees out loud. In the warehouse, the smell of dust and wet cardboard mingled with the rush of closings. Elena was already with Daniel's sister, gloved and sweaty, organizing boxes labeled by type, crockery, fabrics, books, and the scene, so prosaic, seemed designed to eliminate any risk of misunderstanding. Daniel arrived, nodded neutrally, picked up weights, tied ribbons, and as they walked from the warehouse to the van, a box slipped and crashed to the floor, scattering black and white photographs that even he couldn't remember seeing. There was a second of natural embarrassment, a desire to gather everything without looking, but one specific image remained face up, the two of them smiling on a winter day, coats closed, cups in hand, and the detail that stood out wasn't the smile, it was the ignorance of the future. Daniel's sister, with practiced gentleness, rearranged the photos, put them back, and routine covered what could have become a scene. In the end, with the van loaded, Elena thanked him openly, without sentimentality, and offered one last unexpected gesture: "I wanted to carry the boxes alone, drive at night, cross the void and be sure I could do it, but today I allowed help, and that doesn't diminish me, it re-educates me." Daniel nodded, arranged to meet his sister at the institution, and said goodbye with a short wave of his hand that, so simple, showed the exact distance. Later that week, the farewell dinner that the friends insisted on organizing took place, nothing grand, but thoughtful in the details that mattered. Daniel's girlfriend accompanied him, and the hosts took great care to keep everything light, avoiding speeches, opting for a spontaneous dynamic where each person gave Elena a short card, a wish, a memory, without unraveling the seams of the past. During a break, in the hallway leading to the balcony, Elena and Daniel's girlfriend passed each other alone, without an audience, and, by a choice born of their maturity, they stopped to talk. "I wanted to tell you something that needs to be said by me and not by others," Elena began. "I'm leaving not to get closer, but to learn to walk away properly. I know the place you occupy and I know I deserve to lose mine. I won't claim anything that isn't mine." His girlfriend responded with the honesty that Daniel recognized as one of her greatest strengths. "I'm not afraid of you because I trust him and I trust myself, and we don't need to define ourselves before each other by what happened, we can define ourselves by what we choose to do now. Thank you for talking to me, looking into my eyes." There was a brief silence between them that wasn't tense, but rather one of recognition. Daniel, in the distance, watched two worlds he'd long feared seeing collide silently, simply colliding. Daniel's moral dilemma, however, still had a twist that hadn't been tested. The day before the move, Elena called to say goodbye, and almost immediately afterward, the father of a close friend called Daniel asking for a professional favor involving a contact Elena had in her new city. It was a social project that could gain momentum with this bridge, and the most efficient way would be to ask Elena to introduce Daniel to whoever could solve it. The request, innocent on the surface, touched on the boundary he had set for himself, not to turn forgiveness into a utility scheme. He came clean with his girlfriend, laying the dilemma on the table with all its edges. I can accept and risk reactivating a two-way street I don't want, or I can refuse and let an important project waste time, and neither path makes me completely comfortable. Her response was patient and firm. If you accept, be clear about your proposal and your limits. Write the message as if it would be read by you and me 5 years from now, without any room for error. If you decline, do so because it's best for your peace of mind, not as a gesture of revenge. Daniel thought, breathed, and chose the path of transparency. He sent Elena a short, objective text, explaining the bridge he needed, leaving the technical nature of the request both implicit and explicit. The response arrived within minutes, equally objective, with the contact details, context, and a closing that sealed their mutual concern. I hope it's helpful, please continue with ease. The project moved forward, the bridge worked, and no one had to cross anything they shouldn't have. Moving day arrived. Friends spread out on the sidewalk with boxes, the truck's engine roared, the doorman signed the exit permit, and Elena walked through the rooms with one last careful look, not to savor the memories, but to check she hadn't left anything pending. Daniel decided to drop by quickly to return a signed document, and his presence there, amidst the duct tape and echo of bare walls, had the clean feel of someone who no longer owed anything to the past. They met in the empty living room, and Elena produced a set of keys on the old keychain, handing it to him. I considered leaving it with the owner directly, but realized I was avoiding looking at the last door, and I chose to face it. Here it is. Daniel took the keys, asked if she needed any final help. She said no, that she needed to cross the hallway alone, and then uttered a sentence that pierced the air without regret: "Thank you for not letting me be defined by my worst gesture. I leave knowing I can be more than that." Daniel responded with something that, months before, would have seemed impossible to say without bitterness: "Have a good trip, make the most of the chance you're giving yourself." When the truck turned the corner and the street became just a street again, Daniel walked to his car with the exact sensation of when a song ends on time, without a slurred note. That night, he had dinner with his girlfriend at a small restaurant, and the conversation revealed a next step that was unhurried but had direction. She told him a simple dream, the two of them signing a lease on a new place, the size of theirs now, with plants on the porch and books arranged their way, and the image, without performative promises, outlined a possible and solid future. Daniel opened his heart with newly cemented maturity. "I want to build this place with you without a ghost in the closet, and that's why today, more than yesterday, I know exactly what I can't allow to enter when the door is open." They both laughed lightly because that was the first night in months without a shadow lurking between one sentence and the next. Days later, with Elena now settled in another city, a message from her arrived for a large group of friends, a belated farewell text with a photo of the new apartment's window, plants on the windowsill, a late afternoon sky, and a caption that took no shortcuts: "I've arrived, I'm starting over, and I'm learning to speak softly to hear the right things." Daniel read it, didn't reply in private, just left a good luck emoji in the group, as people who share civility would, and returned to work with a lightness that was evident in his posture, not his speech. Over the weekend, he and his girlfriend visited a co-working space where she planned to open a small studio, an old project now taking shape, and the way they planned together revealed that the center of his life had moved smoothly. Even with the cycle closed, life still held one final test for their newly found coherence. A mutual friend organized a virtual get-together to catch up with those who had scattered across different cities, and for a few minutes, everyone appeared in little squares, laughing, and exchanging news. Elena joined in, gave a general hello, and the conversation continued smoothly. Midway through the conversation, someone brought up a topic about choices and consequences, not to expose anyone, but to discuss an article they had read. The discussion was honest, with each person sharing their own experience, and when Daniel spoke, he chose words that neither accused nor justified himself. He said that some losses teach more than victories, that fidelity is a daily practice, not an adjective, that forgiveness is not reconciliation, and that if we make a mistake, the best restitution is to learn and not repeat it. On the other side of the screen, Elena nodded without needing to reply. The meeting ended with light promises of future visits without a set date, and the call ended without anyone having stepped back. One Tuesday afternoon, Daniel received an envelope in the mail with no return address on the outside. He recognized the handwriting, yet opened it without any expectations. Inside was a thick card with a short phrase, "Thank you for being the right person even when I was the wrong one." There were no requests, no reminders, no attempts to win him back, just the signature and a period. He tucked the card away in a folder where important documents were kept, not out of attachment, but because he recognized that certain milestones deserve a place in the archives, not on the altar. That evening, while chopping vegetables for dinner, he told his girlfriend, who listened calmly and returned a smile that sealed the deal. Then, she held his hand for a second longer than necessary, saying in a few words what mattered: "We're on the same side of history." The descending action then settled into this territory where dilemmas aren't erased with pretty phrases, but resolved through coherent, repeated choices. Daniel realized that the true test of what he had learned wouldn't be the performative goodbye, but rather the ordinary days when nothing happened, but when he protected the new house from old leaks. And, at the same time, on the other side of a different landscape, Elena enrolled in night classes, made new friends, wrote notes to herself stuck on the refrigerator with reminders of self-respect, and, little by little, stopped presenting herself to others through the negative aspects of what she had done. Nothing in this new phase had the speed of movie stories, and it was precisely this responsible slowness that quietly paved the way for the final movement, the one that wouldn't need fireworks to be impactful, because it already silently carried the message that would remain. Time passed without asking permission, and what once seemed like an impossible knot to undo became a taut thread, ready to be cut for good. Daniel and his girlfriend found a new apartment, small but with a balcony that received morning light and where they had already planted their first plants. The smell of coffee early in the morning, the conversations while chopping vegetables for dinner, the plans made in complicit silence, all of this built a home that didn't need to compete with anything from the past. He felt that each day solidified a life entirely focused on the present, and there was no more room for ghosts. His trust in her and her trust in him were not constantly declared, but were present in the way they looked at each other, in the tranquility of knowing they were chosen daily. It was a relationship built with the stones he once carried as weight, now used as a firm foundation. Meanwhile, Elena, now settled in her new city, began reinventing herself away from the eyes that knew her for what she had accomplished. She enrolled in courses, made friends in cafes and bookstores, and found a job that required responsibility and focus. At first, she felt an uncomfortable loneliness, as if the echo of the past still tried to reach her, but gradually she understood that she needed to fill this silence with something of her own. She discovered pleasure in cooking for herself, in walking the streets at dusk, in not having to explain her life to anyone. She learned that starting over wasn't about changing addresses, but about changing attitudes. And, more than that, she realized she never again wanted to be the person she once was, someone who, in exchange for a fleeting desire, gave up true love and a peace she didn't know how to value. The inevitable reunion between the two happened much later, at a wedding between close friends. It was a chilly night, the hall lit by hundreds of small lamps, the tables decorated with flowers and candles. Daniel arrived with a companion, wearing a dark suit that fit him perfectly, and Elena entered shortly after, alone, wearing a simple but elegant dress, wearing a discreet smile. When they saw each other, there was no tension or nostalgia, just a nod of mutual respect. During the reception, they passed each other a few times in the hallway, exchanged quick, polite words, and at no point was there room for anything more than that. For Elena, that moment was confirmation that the love she had once destroyed had transformed into something else, untouchable and beyond her reach. For Daniel, it was proof that the forgiveness he offered left no room for relapse, that it was a definitive marker between what was and what is. The most symbolic scene of the night, however, happened without anyone noticing immediately. When the music changed to a slow number, Daniel stood up, offered his hand to his girlfriend, and the two danced with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove to the world. Elena watched from afar, and felt not envy, but a sharp pang of belated understanding. That look of his, that smile, belonged to someone else now, and nothing in the world could change that. It was like watching a window gently close, not violently, but with the inevitability of what had already been decided. Fate, however, had a test of its own in store for Elena. Months later, an old acquaintance approached her with interest, someone who knew little about her past and who treated her with kindness and patience. She hesitated at first, fearing repeating patterns, but decided to be honest from the start, telling him enough for him to understand her scars and stories. To her surprise, he didn't back down, but he made it clear that he wouldn't accept living in the shadow of past mistakes. This made her realize that if she wanted true love again, she would need to remain firm in her resolve not to lose herself. It wouldn't be a quick path, but she was willing to take it. For Daniel, life went on with new achievements, small projects completed, and the tranquility of a stable relationship. The memory of Elena became like a photograph stored in a forgotten album, something he could look at without pain, only with the knowledge that it was part of his development as a person. Every now and then, a polite message would emerge from a group of friends, a greeting at social occasions, and that was it. There was no need for more, and that was liberating. The betrayal that had once nearly destroyed him had lost its power to affect him because he chose not to live for it. In the final, silent chapter of this story, they both received an invitation to a community event in their hometown. Daniel went with his partner, now fiancé, and Elena decided to participate alone, as a volunteer. At the end of the day, already in the parking lot, they ran into each other by chance. The sun was setting, the sky tinged orange, and the air had that late afternoon freshness that seems to suspend time. They exchanged a simple greeting, and Elena, before turning to leave, said something that carried more sincerity than any previous request: "I hope you're happy for all the days I didn't know how to make you." Daniel calmly replied, "I am, and I hope you find that too." There was nothing more to say. Each got into their cars and headed in their own direction, certain that they no longer needed to cross paths for the past to remain in place. And so, the story reached its true end. Daniel continued building the home he'd always dreamed of, with someone who respected him and cherished the love they shared. Elena found a quieter path, made of conscious choices and the courage to look herself in the mirror without apology. Love, betrayal, forgiveness, and loss had become living lessons, shaping them so they wouldn't make the same mistakes again. If you followed this far, leave your thoughts on this story in the comments, how it affected you, and share your thoughts on the characters' choices. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving intense and meaningful stories. Let this narrative serve as a clear reminder: betrayal destroys more than a relationship, it erodes trust and respect, and often erases unique opportunities that never return. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, we believe that fidelity and respect are the foundation of any true love. Never forget, some losses are irreversible, and the choice to betray can cost much more than you imagine.